Good morning. I'm Mara Rudman, the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress. Welcome to today's event. Before we get started, let me just do a quick piece of housekeeping to say that live captioning is available by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Now, I am thrilled to be introducing Representative Ayanna Pressley today. She's been a champion and a leader across so many areas, including disability justice. I will say more about her and her work in a moment. After Congresswoman Pressley has talked with us, we'll then bring in our panel. First, I'd like to set the stage. This past year has highlighted just how important it is to have a disability justice lens on policy. Hundreds of thousands of Americans with disabilities have been hospitalized since the pandemic began. We could possibly see one of the largest increases in disability rates since the polio epidemic, with 1/3 of COVID-19 survivors reporting long-term effects as a result of infection. The disproportionate impacts of COVID-19, including on Americans with disabilities, has been a trend throughout the pandemic. Beyond the direct impact of the virus, we have witnessed strained access to healthcare and mental health resources, inadequate funding and support for community-based services, and, in the last administration, gross inequity in the federal response. Too often, policymakers have lost sight of the fact that disability justice is intrinsic to good policy outcomes. Disability issues are healthcare issues, they're education issues, they're democratic, small d democratic, and economic issues. And we cannot tackle effectively the biggest challenges we face as a nation without ensuring that Americans who have disabilities and their families have the support and resources they need to thrive. This means making sure that disability justice is a core component to policymaking as a rule, not only in times of crisis. We need to keep that front of mind as we mark the 31st anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. When the ADA became law in 1990, it ensured fundamental protections for Americans with disabilities. It meant, for millions of Americans, not losing your job because of employer discrimination. It meant a legal protection from retaliation and a legal requirement to ensure equal access to schools, public transport, and public places. The ADA was a landmark piece of legislation, but the intervening 3 decades have revealed how much further we have to go. Today, there is still insufficient support for community-based services, insufficient access to affordable housing for Americans with disabilities, and insufficient access to the ballot box. CAP has been on the front lines calling for systemic change. In just a few days, we will be releasing a report highlighting the work we must do to serve the many Americans with disabilities, including through investing in infrastructure, equitable services, and social supports. We must do everything we can to ensure that people with disabilities are not left behind. We are honored and humbled to be in the trenches with leaders like Representative Pressley. Congresswoman Pressley has been at the forefront, proposing changes that address systemic barriers that people with disabilities face. She has supported the expansion of home and community-based services, the end to restraint and seclusion practices in schools, which disproportionately affect Black students with disabilities. She has called for restoring supplemental security income and ending sub-minimum wages. She has pushed hard for the country to do better in these areas as a leader has been open about her own experience as a Black woman with a disability. And I will say also, I'm particularly proud to be introducing Congresswoman Pressley because I hail from Massachusetts, and so I consider her particularly one of my representatives. So Congresswoman Pressley, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you.
Before I begin, I just wanted to describe myself. I'm a Black woman living with alopecia, so I have a bald head. I'm wearing orange lipstick and gold hoops, and I'm wearing a striped dress. Thank you all for inviting me to join you today and for your ongoing partnership. It is good to be in virtual community with all of you. You have been on the front lines of the fight for disability justice day in and day out. And it is an honor to join you and to be your sister in solidarity in this work. Today we come around this virtual table joined by so many advocates, and advocates that I see and consider to be mentors and pace setters, trailblazers who call the question every day that changes the conversation and advances the work. And I think of all of those who have come before us, and fought for our shared humanity. I hope that I am every day, as a Black woman living with a disability, that I am honoring the legacy of Barbara Jordan, a Black woman with a disability, and Fannie Lou Hamer, a Black woman with a disability, who understood the connectedness of the work of liberation, how intersectional it is. And I know that there are some who are tempted to think that the civil rights movement is over, or to perhaps only subscribe to a one-dimensional, a shallow narrative of the movement. Some would have you think that Rosa sat and John crossed a bridge and Martin marched and suddenly our full liberation was realized. But we all know that that isn't true. We are still in the midst of the civil rights movement. And disability justice is a key central aspect of that fight, because truly our destinies are tied. The Americans with Disabilities Act, yes, it was a historic victory. And 31 years later, we celebrate the foremothers and fathers and non-binary siblings of the movement and affirm that this fight is not over. As Coretta Scott King once said, freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. The disability community in America has faced systemic disenfranchisement in the form of what I would characterize as policy violence for generations, from unconscionable barriers to healthcare, to income limits for those seeking accessible housing, to barriers to marry who you love, to the attacks that we see coordinated in states across the country on voting rights, which is also a disability justice issue. So we find ourselves in a moment of national reckoning on racial injustice. And I fundamentally believe that that disability justice must be a part of that intersectional conversation and intersectional and inclusive movement. We must affirm that Black disabled lives matter. When nearly half of those murdered by police have a disability, we know that our systems are deeply broken. And together we must legislate in the same way that harm has been legislated and been very precise. We must be just as precise in legislating healing, in legislating justice, in legislating accountability. And that begins with honest conversation about where we stand. And intentional legislation must follow that. Now, the pandemic has really laid bare the inequities and disparities in Massachusetts and across the nation. It's exacerbated them. Our communities have experienced deep, painful loss. But together, we have fought back against deadly and discriminatory policies that would limit access to care for people with disabilities. Your leadership on this critical work is really a testament to the power of both representation against someone that calls the question and the power of organizing. Now, our work is far from over. In this critical moment where the people have given Democrats, the White House, the Senate, the House, and a mandate, we must advance critical, long overdue policy change. I reject the pundits' false binary choices. It's $400 billion for home and community-based services and critical SSI reform. It's housing justice that centers the disability community and free public transit that is accessible. You know that disability justice is not just about one bucket of policy. It is a critical lens we must bring to every policymaking table. And that is why my eyes are fixed on the policies that we need to advance true justice, particularly as we take on these fights in this reconciliation process. Reverend Barber says that this reckoning demands of us a reconstruction. I see all of you as community builders in this reconstruction, in this third reconstruction. And I see this reconciliation process as a critical part of that reconstruction. And finally, as I try not to get emotional, on a personal note, I want to thank the community for the warm embrace that they gave me in my new walk. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for engaging me. Thank you for giving me community, not only as an elected official, someone that you hold accountable and you see as a co-conspirator, in the work that we do to advance disability justice. But again, for being a safe space when I felt very vulnerable and very fragile in my struggle with alopecia. I thank the disability community for embracing me. Some of you who are at this table received many a late night text from me. And thank you for teaching me that we're not just here to occupy space, but we're here to create it. You know, it was historic to see President Biden yesterday acknowledge the growth of the disability community and how many folks are dealing with long haul COVID, have joined the disability community throughout the past year. And the fact that he did that, because I really do believe that all movements, begin with language, which reflects cultural shifts. And that language change is hopefully followed by policy and budget change, but people have to first feel seen. So that becomes with them being named. And the reason why long haulers were named has everything to do with the strength and the vigilance of this movement. So let us be fortified and emboldened in that. It is my sincerest hope that we will now welcome them with open arms and embrace in our shared struggle for true justice and liberation. Again, that level of disability that President Biden named yesterday is a tribute to your continued organizing, your sweat equity, and your laboring in what I would call radical love. Being in community with all of you, it fortifies me, it emboldens me, it encourages me that together we are building a world that sees us fully. Thank you for what you do every day. And I'll see you on the front lines.
I want to thank Congresswoman Presley for speaking and sharing amazing sort of vision for sort of the next steps for the disability community. Next up, what I want to do is actually bring up our panelists, who are all individuals who have been on the front lines working in conjunction with folks on the Hill to really help upraise the disability community and really have been in the trenches fighting for disability rights and disability justice. So who we have on as our distinguished speakers include Megan Buckles, who is our senior policy analyst at the Disability Justice Initiative. Prior to joining CAP, Megan was a client's rights advocate for Disability Rights California, a special education law fellow, and a law clerk at the Disability Rights Legal Center. Next, we have Allie Cannington. Allie is a white, Jewish, queer, disabled activist and organizer from the Bay Area. And as the manager for the advocacy and organizing, Allie leads the Kelsey field building efforts to increase disabled participation and leadership across housing, policy, and practice. Next, we have Jen Deerenwater. Jen is a bisexual, two-spirit, multiply disabled citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and an award-winning journalist and organizer who covers the myriad of issues that her community faces with intersectional lens and been featured in a wide range of publications. Jen is the founding executive director of Crushing Colonialism and a Disability Futures Fellow. Anna Pern. Anna is a disabled Asian American advocate and parent, founder of the Chinatown Disability Advocacy Project and was President Obama's designee to the White House Interagency Council on Women and Girls. She is currently leading the Philadelphia COVID-19 Health Equity Coalition to promote vaccine equity. And then we have Yomi Rong. Yomi is an ADA compliance manager for the Northern California-based Sutter Health, where her role is to ensure full access to quality medical care for people with disabilities. Outside of healthcare, Yomi is a consultant, trainer, activist, and self-described disability justice dreamer. She's the former executive director of the renowned Center for Independent Living. Welcome, panelists. I am so pleased to have you all on. I want to ask, the civil rights groups from across the country, including ADAPT and Black Panthers movement, have all helped to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which codified basic civil rights protections for disabled people. Now, 31 years later, how does the ADA continue to impact you and your community? And I'd love for Megan to come on and speak about that.
Absolutely. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Buckles. I think it's so important to celebrate the ADA for obvious reasons. It was a historic piece of legislation that has lasting effects on the 1 in 4 Americans that have a disability in this country. I am proudly a part of the ADA generation, where the majority of my life, I have been protected from discrimination in public places. As a Black disabled woman, because of the civil rights movement and because of the ADA, I have the housing and education and the job I do now. Unfortunately, that conversation can't be untied to the last 3 decades of attacks on the ADA and the attacks to diminish its power, protections, and enforcement. Along with that conversation, we cannot approach the ADA or disability justice without an intersectional lens. It has always mattered. It mattered when the Black Panther Party helped support Section 504 protests, and it matters now when nearly 40% of African Americans with disabilities live in poverty. Even when you're adjusting for education levels, disabled African Americans are still more likely to live in poverty than any other disability group. And the fights that we continue now are not just for physical access, but true inclusion and equity. And that must include that intersectional lens of the most marginalized folks, like Black disabled individuals, the Indigenous community, and the LGBT community. Unfortunately, what we've seen in the community and over the last 3 years is that policy and practice don't match. There's still such a lack of access and equity for people with disabilities, and particularly those of color with disabilities. And COVID-19, like many of us have already said, didn't create these issues. They have only perpetuated the already existing issues. COVID-19 has disproportionately affected and killed those in the disability community. It has created delays in other healthcare services and has created a growing disabled population with long haulers. It's also important to not negate the mental health crisis that COVID has created on top of the racial tensions, particularly harmful to the AAPI and Black communities happening now. And so I'd say that COVID is the perfect opportunity to celebrate the accomplishments of the ADA, but really highlight how far we have to go in every sector, whether it's technology and the lack of fully accessible websites for vaccine rollouts to transportation. I know that this pandemic has really affected me. I'm educated and I have almost every opportunity and access to technology, and yet I couldn't register for the vaccine on my own. And so I just think this is the time to look where we came from, but really look to where we can go beyond the pandemic.
Thank you, Megan, for talking about that, particularly for disabled people of color. Ali, I know you've been working in the housing area. Would love to hear your reflections on.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Ali. I use they and she pronouns, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the legal and policy mandates that have strengthened and complemented the law, such as the Supreme Court decision of Olmstead, affirming people's right to live in the most integrated setting with their individualized services, and the Fair Housing Act and the affirmatively furthering fair housing rules, all have mandated equal access and protection for disabled Americans to have housing that is community-based, integrated, free from discrimination, accessible, just to name a few. And y'all know, based on what's been said, this is far from the truth, what's happening on the ground. So despite this strong legal framework, our nation's policy and market conditions are still failing to make the promise of the ADA, including integrated community living and housing, a reality for a majority of Americans. Less than 5% of our nation's housing is accessible to people with mobility and sensory-related disabilities. No one on SSI can afford market rate rent. The highest rates of housing discrimination are disability-related. Millions of people with disabilities are living in congregate and institutional settings, are unhoused or unstably housed. And all of these people with disabilities across the country have the right to live in their own homes, but housing and supports have never been adequately invested in. Of course, these housing crises are most acute for disabled Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islanders, and other people of color and low and no income communities. At the Kelsey, our work of building communities and changing systems is guided and propelled by the promise of the ADA and the legacy and current movements that are led for and by disabled people. Specifically, how can we create the policy and market conditions so that affordable, accessible, and inclusive housing can become the norm? Affordable to all income levels, accessible to people with all types of disabilities, and that housing that is service ready and inclusive to people with disabilities who need home and community-based services in order to live our best lives. As our movement colleagues are pushing for critical advancements and investments in Medicaid, home and community-based services, we are asking ourselves at the Kelsey, and I invite us all today to ask ourselves, at the intersection of housing and disability that is intrinsically tied to racial justice, what will it take to ensure that the commensurate housing investments are made along with services to make the promise of the ADA more of a reality? The promise of every disabled American to live their best and most thriving lives in the communities of their choice.
Thank you so much, Ali. I think housing, particularly for the disability community, is a significant concern and continues to need to be addressed. Anna, you have been working in the API spaces, and we know, particularly with some of the backlash due to COVID, how has the ADA sort of affected particularly the API community, but also immigrants in general?
Thank you so much, Mia. My name is Anna. I'm going to give an image description. I'm an Asian American woman with shoulder-length black hair wearing a blue dress. I have a blue virtual background with the words Chinatown Disability Advocacy Project behind me. So as Mia mentioned in the introduction, I'm the co-founder of the Chinatown Disability Advocacy Project. We're a community of immigrants with disabilities, families, caregivers, advocates, government, grassroots partners. We advocate for systemic change, language access, disability justice, and inclusion in Greater Philadelphia and across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I helped found CDAP 6 years ago because we weren't welcome in Asian American spaces nor disability spaces. We were tired of asking for a seat at the table, so we created our own. So it's a tremendous pleasure to see Mia head the Disability Justice Initiative and see the impact she's already making by making sure we underscore intersectionality. The ADA is a cornerstone in my community. CDAP is using the ADA to guide equitable community development and drive transformation of our infrastructure, like our Philadelphia Parks and Recreation System. Still, many Black, Brown, immigrant, disabled people and families that I've organized over the years were unaware that the ADA and other laws existed. And that's not a reflection on them, but a reflection on the disability community and who we think should be included. When I look at gatherings like the ADA White House celebration yesterday, in which Sachin Pravithran, a disabled immigrant who now leads the Access Board, was excluded, I wonder if you all even know we exist. Were there not enough lawn chairs? Was there not a large enough space? More than 1/4, or 27.5% of direct care workers and 30.3% of nursing home housekeeping and maintenance workers were immigrants. Yet white leaders talking about better care, better jobs, and home and community-based services will hardly mention comprehensive immigration reform or provide language access to include immigrants in these spaces. When Reverend Jesse Jackson, who has Parkinson's disease, spends the 80th anniversary marching to end the Jim Crow filibuster, I'm reminded how the Black people, Black Indigenous people of color, disabled communities fight for everyone. We march, petition, phone bank, text bank, knock on doors, organize, and even litigate. But because our demands for liberation aren't palatable, our issues are tabled by white leaders for another day. All of these examples are a reflection of the racism and xenophobia that is pervasive within the disability community and how even white progressive disabled leaders uphold and benefit from white supremacy. So I hope everyone listening today will become accomplices in forcefully demanding change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. My next question is, we know that COVID really ravaged all of our communities, but in particular, disabled, Black, Indigenous people of color, it disproportionately affected our communities. Now, I'm going to ask each of you sort of how has your community been affected by COVID? And I really want to start with Yomi. Yomi, I have been on a couple of roundtables, and you have a very, very powerful story that you have dealt with, particularly around COVID. So I just really wanted to open it up with you.
Thank you so much, Mia. First, I want to say, Anna, that was fire. And thank you for your work. Thank you for your truth. Thank you for your just unflinching illumination of what I really understand to be disability justice issues that often go unrecognized in disability rights spaces. So before I even do an image description, I just wanted to thank you for that, Anna. I am, just quickly to give an image description, I am a Black woman zooming in from occupied Ohlone territory, also known as Oakland, California. I'm wearing silver rimmed glasses and a flower print blue and brown shirt. And my background is my organized chaos of my home office / guest room / everything during this pandemic. So to Mia and everybody at CAP, thank you for inviting me into this space. And Mia, thank you for specifically for allowing me to speak about the impact of COVID on BIPOC communities. So as you know, Mia, and as some people who are close to me know, I lost a parent due to COVID. And my father died in March. He got COVID in December. He then dealt with long COVID for 3 months. It was a horrible experience for him and for our family. And so, what I think about is just the way that this pandemic has ravaged communities of color. It has led to immeasurable trauma on a magnitude I think that we have yet to fully realize as a society. And I don't know that we can hold that and deal with that trauma until we can move beyond these surges and cycles of sickness and death that we're currently in. Our communities will not be able to heal until we get out of this. We're just under siege right now from this virus. Our whole society and way of life remains in peril as scores of people are unvaccinated for a variety of reasons. And too many people deny the severity of the situation. We must act for the collective good. That's what this moment demands of all of us, and yet we are not there. And the greatest risk continues to be felt by vulnerable groups, including people with disabilities, including immigrants, including non-English speaking citizens, and those who don't necessarily have citizenship in this country, but are our neighbors nonetheless, for our unhoused populations, for our elders, for people who are underinsured or uninsured, people who do not have access to appropriate health care, who can't get to mass vaccination sites, who can't get tested, or who have fears. And some of those fears of both the information that's coming out of our medical and science community about the pandemic, the virus itself, its transmission, but also the efficacy of our vaccines. So much of that fear in our communities, and particularly in the Black community, is because our medical establishment and our medical community has done us dirty for generations. We have, I would say, very legitimate mistrust of medical testing, of research. And I think that the way to address that and move beyond that is to have more robust public conversations and education about science, about public health, to hear more, to listen more to people's concerns and fears for their own health and safety and that of their families, and to meet people where they're at, and to have conversations that do not shame people, do not belittle them, do not call them stupid or question their intelligence, but really get to the root of where is this fear and concern in our communities and how can we redress that. And so the other person that I wanted to just raise up in this conversation is my friend and comrade, Allie, because Allie did so much labor around just connecting people to vaccine, right? Giving people codes to be able to register for vaccine, reaching out to BIPOC and marginalized communities to say, hey, we heard that there's vaccines at this location, why don't you go there? And sometimes the information, changed on in the moment or changed the next day. And sometimes maybe it wasn't good information that we could act on in the moment because things were always shifting. But Ali, I just want to say that I recognize and appreciate the labor and the love that went into trying to get us vaccinated, because as we know in disability justice, we are the ones who will save us. And we move together. We leave no one behind. That is a core principle of disability justice. And it is a core principle of disability justice that has not always been valued or even recognized in the disability rights movement, which is really focused on individuals being able to protect their legal rights and advance socially, economically. And that's important too, but it isn't a just framework. And so what we need to do really is, I'd say in this next generation, as we're building our movement, and as we're both honoring and recognizing and thanking all of those that laid the groundwork for the ADA and who have continued to push for policy reform and just protect this precious civil right that we were given 31 years ago, that we also need to understand the intersection of ableism, the evils of capitalism, the way that this really impacts multi-marginalized folks. And then, and because this is the future, right? Like we're not going anywhere. And we have a whole generation of folks who have been politicized in a very different way than the way I was politicized as a young person. So the ADA was signed into law in 1990, the year that I graduated from high school. And I will say, as we all know, it's one thing to sign a law, it's another thing to implement it. And it takes time for folks to really see the benefit of those protections. And so it wasn't until well after my college experience, which was awful, that I began to see some of the fruits of what it means to have a law that protects that identity. You know, we have the we had civil rights protections, and on some level protections for me as a woman, right? So we have the women's rights movement, civil rights movement, but then we had this thing called disability rights that seemed radical at the time, but impacts actually more people in this country than any other civil right protection, because we are the only group that anybody can join at any time. You can move in and out of our community based on your health status or what's going on with you, and yet this law is here for you too. So anyway, I know that was a long way around of talking about COVID and what it's meant to our community, but like on a personal level, I just want to say that it saddens and angers me that my father, Hugh Joseph Reyes, who served his country in World War II, who was a veteran, who drove a bus in New York City for 20 years, who was a proud Union man, who really loved this country and served this country proudly, felt let down by this country at the end of his life. He felt lied to by his government about the seriousness of this pandemic. He felt lied to by elected officials in the state where he lived, Arizona. There were some states that were very slow to recognize the seriousness of the pandemic and to implement safety precautions that would have spared his life and protected him from getting this virus. And so thank you for allowing me to name him and to talk about him, and all of the work that I do now in healthcare and also in advocacy is really to honor him and his life.
Thank you so much, Yomi, for sharing your story. And I just, yeah, I want to thank you so much. And I love this idea and this, I think particularly around disability justice, about making sure that we care for ourselves and that we build stronger communities, because we are the only ones that can save ourselves, right? I know we're coming up on time, but would really want to hear from Jen Deerenwater, particularly because we know Indigenous communities were significantly affected by COVID, that US laws have treated Indigenous communities unfairly and unjustly. And I just want to really open it up for you to not only talk about sort of how COVID affected your community, but also sort of what are the things that you are hoping will come out sort of as we continue to look towards the future.
Osio, hello. It's really great to be with you all. And Wado, thank you for having me here. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm on occupied Piscataway land known as Washington, D.C. And you can learn whose land you're on with the app Native Land. So the Native community had the highest per capita age-adjusted death rates due to COVID of any other racial or ethnic group. We also have some of the highest disability and illness rates in this country. And this isn't due to genetics, but due rather to colonialism and genocide. Per capita, we're the poorest racial group in this country with the highest rates of houselessness, starvation, sexual assault, trafficking, incarceration, and so much more. We were struggling to survive multiple crises before COVID-19 happened. And part of the issue is that the US government has never honored its trust and treaty responsibility to us, which made us incredibly vulnerable to this pandemic. Examples of this are the pathetic funding of Indian health services and urban Indian health programs. While the number changes based on the annual budget, typically less than $2,000 is allocated to each IHS eligible Native person per year for care. It's worse for the 71% of us who live in urban and suburban areas, as we get maybe 30 cents per urban Native per year. This wouldn't even buy an aspirin. You know, we can't get basic care at the facilities that do exist for things like childbirth, setting broken bones, or a rape exam. To give you an idea of how horrific IHS care is, someone recently shared on Twitter that IHS left 2 clamps in their abdomen and it was only discovered 18 years later. Of course, there is almost no ability for our healthcare systems to care for our people who had COVID-19 or who had chronic health conditions that require regular care, leaving many of our people without their regular care and putting their lives in further danger. Medical rationing has been particularly terrifying for me. We have so few urban Indian health centers that many of us didn't get priority COVID vaccinations like we should have, and some of our people traveled back to their lands to get vaccinated, which was a public health issue. My tribal citizenship doesn't end when I leave my nation's reservation, and the US government's treaties and trust responsibilities don't end because I live in DC. And I don't believe it's an oversight that we don't have Native health facilities in DC. We saw a rise in mutual aid and our tribal government stepping up to care for us. My nation, the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, paid its non-essential employees to stay home, and this included non-natives. We closed our non-essential businesses because we believe lives are worth more than dollars. We kept our contraction and death rates relatively low considering the rates in Oklahoma, and that the state never put protections into law like mask mandates. And the vaccination rates are still very low in Oklahoma. Our relatives in South Dakota did contact tracing of anyone who entered their lands and were able to keep their cases lower as a result. Governor Kristi Noem and the Trump administration tried to stop this, which resulted in lawsuits. We've been left to die. You know, we lost many of our elders and fluent language speakers, so this not only took our lives, but took more of our culture. You know, we were never given our CARES funds or other government funding within the time frames set forth by Congress or government agencies. Even getting PPE supplies often proved impossible. The Urban Indian Health Institute was sent body bags and toe tags when they requested PPE and other supplies. Frankly, the US government has used COVID-19 as a cheap and convenient way to continue its campaign of genocide against us. Regardless of political party, the US has made it blatantly clear over the years that it still wants us dead so that it can steal the last of our remaining lands.
Thank you so much, Jen Deerenwater, for really lifting up the issues for Indigenous populations across the US. It's extremely important that we keep in mind, particularly the most vulnerable within our communities. I want to sort of, I know we're kind of running into time, and I do want to at least leave it up for one question from the community. So I wanted to actually pull one of the questions that we got and combine it with our last question, which is, you know, we know that there needs to be work done. Particularly, we know that there needs to be, you know, legislation done, policy changes, but also what kind of cultural things can we add into some of the changes that we can help to uplift the disability community and take care of our own. So I want to go to each one of you. If you can keep it as brief and as succinct as possible, that would be great. But I would love to start with Megan. Megan, we're about to have a report coming out on the ADA talking about COVID, but would love to have you sort of talk about some suggestions.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to my fellow panelists. Your words are truly humbling and powerful and need to be said. And I think it's just the representation on this call is beautiful and what needs to happen in all spaces. I think that would be one of my recommendations, is that intersectionality really matters. And when we're talking about policies, they need to be people first, and they need to take into consideration the most marginalized and the most affected by these policies. I think it's just really, really important to highlight that these health disparities were here long before COVID. And if we have this huge push to like go back to normal, that will be deadly. And that will be deadly for the most marginalized communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color. And so I think as a society, we need to start centering the most marginalized, and we need to start uplifting their voices. And that means investing in social programs and the safety net that like our lives rely on. If only 10% of the 34 million Americans that were affected by COVID get long haul symptoms and try to apply for these services, our system that is already overwhelmed and underfunded is going to collapse. And so I think it's really important. Like Mia said, we have a report coming out celebrating the ADA, which really highlights that when we have such massive impacts on community, it calls for massive change. We need to, in the same way we created massive change during the Great Depression following World War II, that needs to happen now. And unlike what happened in the 40s and 50s, it needs to have an intersectional and racial approach to it. So I just really encourage lawmakers, policymakers, and activists to really focus on what's happening on the ground, what's happening with the most marginalized communities. I also just want to plug one more CAP product. We are doing a series of reports on Black disabled women. Yomi was a part of some of the roundtables that we really tried to focus on what the community is saying about what their needs are and what they want from policymakers. And CAP has and will continue to push for policy and legislative change to increase intersectional data, permanent funding for home and community-based services, paid family leave, affordable and accessible housing, and an investment in mental health, telehealth, and other culturally competent and affordable health services.
Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you. I am really looking forward to the Black women with disabilities pieces that you have coming out soon. Anna, we are both from the AAPI communities. We know there's significant work, particularly culturally, that needs to happen to address the disparities around talking about disabled people and the services that they receive. Can you talk a little bit?
Sure, I'll keep it very brief. I'm just going to say geographic proximity isn't inclusion. Having BIPOC face in a group doesn't mean we are heard. And too often BIPOC disabled people are expected to do the outreach, translation, interpretation as unpaid volunteers if we want to see racial equity achieved. So in all COVID-related advocacy, I just ask that folks be mindful of that in your budgets, in your meetings, be conscious of who you give the mic to speak on our issues. If it's not a BIPOC disabled person, please pass the mic to someone who is. And I'll just say, another example is here in Pennsylvania, our governor had signed a law that allows all K through 12 students to repeat a grade, right? It's a huge second chance, especially for our students with disabilities, except when our state, required all 500 districts to use a standard election form. It was inaccessible and only in English. And so my coalition, Chinatown Disability Advocacy Project, organized with other leaders to fight back and to challenge the lack of language access and accessibility. And thanks to a civil rights attorney who is also a Black disabled advocate, Court Wayberg, we were able to get them to change. And we got our school district of Philadelphia to create an extension. And out of all the 500 school districts, we are the only ones that have made this change. So I just want to point to that as an example, again, of how BIPOC leaders with disabilities are constantly fighting for the changes that benefit everyone. And, if you were at the table lobbying, legislating, trying to figure out how to create a benefit related to COVID for our communities, fight for language access, fight for accessibility, and make sure people, diverse people, are included at the table. So unfortunately, with the Delta variant spreading, I'm deeply worried that we're going to go back to square one, but we've already seen how people are. They've already shown us who they are. I know whatever happens, we'll be organized and ready to fight for equitable access for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I think language access is extremely important. We talk often in the disability community about ASL access, but we also need to talk about other language access as well. So that's super extremely important. Jen Deerenwater, what can we do for the Indigenous populations? How can we support them and ensure that their voices are heard?
Well, we need IHS and urban Indian health programs fully funded. That's number one. The numbers vary, but $10 billion seems to be what tribal leaders agree on that's needed just to bring IHS up to the basic standard of care others in the so-called US receive. If the US government can give money and tax breaks to corporations that already receive corporate welfare, then they can damn well fund Native healthcare and all of the programs that we're on here calling for today. We need infrastructure like roads, electricity, clean running water, and telecommunications to better care for our most vulnerable. I'm very excited to see the rise of digital accessibility, but if you don't have access to high-speed broadband or cell phones, it doesn't matter if that accessibility is there because you're still left behind. We need SSI and SSDI to actually give a living wage, and we need the legal sub-minimum wage earnings to disabled people to be made illegal. We need strong programs for home health care, transportation, healthy food, and high-quality housing that meets our community and cultural standards. We need our lands to stop being polluted and stolen from us through projects like Line 3, which the Biden administration still refuses to pull the permits for. It's no coincidence that some of the most polluted lands in the so-called US are where Native, Black, Brown, and lower income people like disabled people tend to live. And this makes it harder for folks with long haul symptoms to survive and live a healthy life. We need the US government to stop dictating our tribal nations' economic paths so that we can better care for our people. In this way, the government keeps us dependent upon them for survival, which is how they like it. I feel this as both a Native and a disabled person. We are purposefully trapped in a cycle, a nonstop cycle of poverty, abuse, trauma, and death. We must be included in all data collection, especially around health, disability, and COVID-19, as we are often left out of data collection on just about any topic, really. We need a nationwide mask mandate. It's terrifying for me as a DC resident to see workers, some of the workers and tourists returning, none of whom seem to be masked up. We need tribal sovereignty ultimately, and for the US government to get its foot off our necks. Treaties are the supreme law of the land, and it's way past time the government follow its own laws. We also need the disability community to show up for us. We need your solidarity just as you need us. Regardless of what brought someone to these lands, these are still Indigenous lands, and we shouldn't have to continue to die because of the actions of others. Disability justice means we show up for all our people, and that includes chronically ill, deaf, and disabled Indigenous people and those who have long haul symptoms.
Thank you so much, Jen, for lifting up those very significant needs, and totally 100% agree that the disability community has a long way to continue to make sure that they are addressing the issues and disparities around Indigenous populations. Yomi, I want to give you the last word. Want to find out, so what's in your head when you're thinking about like what you want to uplift in terms of how can we go forward from here?
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for allowing me to speak. And I've been thinking about that. I mean, I think we first and foremost need to continue to fund robust research into this virus and variants so that we can protect lives now. And in the future, I think vaccination should be mandated for all but those with legitimate medical or religious exemptions, like no excuses. I think that we need to protect and fortify the social safety net because we saw too many people slip into poverty, maybe that were on the margins before, or slip deeper into poverty. And the social safety net is everything from food subsidies to housing vouchers to unemployment insurance, student loan forgiveness, eviction moratoriums, mortgage relief, because all of these things impact BIPOC communities disproportionately. A guaranteed minimum income would help individuals and families be able to weather unpredictable economic downturns. And I think, just fortifying workplace return to work policies that protect people with disabilities, including the millions of people with long COVID who have suddenly joined our movement but just don't know it yet. They're going to need our allyship, our support, our advocacy, and our labor. And so we also need to be protecting them and educating them on their rights. And finally, I will say none of this will be possible. The future that we all want and dream and deserve will not be possible if we do not protect the franchise. There are forces that are trying to strip voting rights from the majority in this country because they fear slipping into the minority. I would say white supremacy is on its last gasp, and they were pulling out all the stops to keep us from the ballot box. And we have to protect voting rights. We have to protect voting rights for folks for whom voting is a lifeline. It is saving your life. We need to educate people to vote for their best interest and for the collective good. And I think that joining the urgent fight to protect voting rights is going to be key to the future that we all want and deserve.
100% agree with you. That is one of the reasons why CAP released a enhancing accessibility report, which was co-authored by Daniel Root at our democracy team. And, I just want to say thank you so much for all of you coming to speak. Jen, Anna, Yomi, Megan, Ali, all of you, thank you so much. A special thank you to Congresswoman Presley. Thank you to Mara. We hope you have found this extremely informative and are able to understand the importance of the ADA and the need for continued work to ensure all disabled people, including BIPOC disabled people, have our rights protected. Please look out for our report on the ADA and expanding disability rights and justice during COVID, which will be released shortly. I hope everybody has a wonderful day.